let's let everyone come on in. Let's give them a chance to drop in. All right, just one moment, please. All right, let's get this show on the road. Welcome, tech artists from around the world. It's 12:30 and it's Friday, and that means it's time for another episode of Tech Art Talk Live. My name is Chris, and I will be your host for today's session. Now, last week, well, actually the last 2 weeks, we've been talking about visual effects. Now, last week we talked about the rules associated with the rules of visual effects, and those were good and fine, but we really didn't talk about any visual effects per se. All right, today is the first week that we're going to be going into the four types of visual effect. And this week we're going to be talking about lighting and post-processing. Okay, and it sounds like we've got a fire alarm going on right when I started this broadcast. Oh, don't you love the wonderfulness of live broadcasting? You never can expect anything. I figured during lunchtime, what the hey, but you know, the folks here are just determined to make life a veritable hell for me. Okay, well, if you can handle a little bit of ambient noise, well then I can too. So I'm going to try to speak louder and kind of like, I'm going to try to bring down my gain on my microphone just a little bit. I've got this fancy new microphone, and I'm going to do my best to get a little closer to speak up so you can't hear what's going on with the fire alarm. But anyway, in my humble opinion, lighting and post-processing are the most important visual effects at all. You're probably going, why? Well, I thought particles was. When you talk about visual effects, I thought you're talking about particles. Okay, lighting and post-processing. This is where it is, baby. This is the number one most important of all visual effects, and we're going to get to that. All right. Oh, let's see. Let's get right to this. All right, let me get to my demonstration here. All right. Very good. Okay, so let's talk about lighting and visual effects. Lighting and lighting effects, actually, in per se. Just lighting alone. Okay. Okay. So I think part of the thing is we never really defined what visual effects actually are. So let's define what visual effects are. And in a very simple term, visual effects are anything that is added to the gameplay or the actual narrative that contributes to the emotion, mood, and feel of the gameplay or the character integration. It's not actually part of all those, but it's something that embellishes all of those things, and it brings up the heightened emotion of the situation. And in my opinion, lighting is the most important visual effect. You're probably going, oh, that's why we have lighters. No, lighters are just very fancy visual effects artists that are focusing on just one precise and very difficult piece of art, and that is the art of lighting. And lighting has been used for thousands of years to help move story and gameplay. You know, not just on games or in real time, but also in film, but also on stage. So this is nothing new. And also, it makes the use of shadows. Shadows are a super important visual effect. It does a lot of things, but if anything, shadows help integrate the character to the environment and the environment back onto the character. They kind of exchange shadows together, and that's why they kind of play copacetically. And then, in addition to shadows, is lighting. Okay, so characters might have lights, and they have lights like in their eyes, or if they're carrying a gun or something, and they're going to be projecting light onto their immediate environment. In the same way, the environment projects lighting back onto them, and so therefore they're not only exchanging shadows with each other, but they're exchanging light. Okay, lights move the story and the gameplay. It directs the viewer's eyes to tell the viewer where to go. You can't help it, but contrast helps attract the viewer's attention, and it's that contrast that makes folks automatically draw their attention towards a specific direction. Lighting helps create depth. And in other words, if you had a very diffuse looking scene, and if you didn't have any shadows, you didn't have any kind of gradation, if you didn't have any kind of fall off, then everything would look flat. So lighting helps create depth. It creates dimension. It makes the situation look deeper than it actually is. And so light is used to manipulate that linear perspective, value, color, atmosphere, scale, relationships, volume, and planes of light. Okay, this is all standard art stuff, but this is why lights are so important, because it manipulates all of these things. It helps enhance mood. It helps with that. I mean, like, you don't go to a haunted house and have it bright up like the lit day. No, it's lit very subtly in order to enhance the horror. But likewise, you don't go to watch Barney's and Barney is like lit like the Groovy Ghoulies. No, because that would scare the little kiddies. So the lighting has a dramatic impact on the overall mood. And of course, lighting is helped to emphasize time of day. I mean, like, if you can tell the difference in the time of day between dusk, between noon, between afternoon, and then on to sunset, and of course midnight. And as we've mentioned it before, the lighting helps integrate characters and their environments together because they're all being manipulated by the same light, so therefore they belong within the same universe. Okay, let's talk about light manipulating shadows. Okay, it adds realism to the scene. It helps anchor the character to the environment. As we mentioned before, the character puts shadows onto the environment, and the environment casts shadows back onto the character. But in reality, in real time, shadows are frickin' expensive. Now, you kind of take it for granted because, oh, UE4 Unity, they handle shadows really well. And yeah, they've been optimized. But what if you're not working with Unity? What if you're not working with UE4? What are you going to do? Well, you've got to do some cheats, and you've got to do what you can to get around it. So therefore, you've got to play tricks with the pipeline in order to do what you can. One of the first tricks that you could do is create a false blobby shadow. And that is, you take your character render, whatever it is, and then you flatten that character according to a vector that is cast by your false light shadow. You cast a light onto your character, that creates a vector, and then you project that light exactly on here. And then you take that squashed character, you remove any color from it, you make it black, and then you put it onto a sprite or a card right underneath it, and voila, you have an instant shadow. So it's a poor man's shadow, but it works like stink, and you'd be surprised how easily it is to implement. Okay, awesome. What you could do is overwhelm your audience. Okay, you might have one particular shadow light that's casting the real shadow, but if you have multiple light sources there, the fact is most audiences won't pick up and go, wait a second, I see one shadow, we have the character shadow, and they just kind of accept it as normal. They don't take it and really think and realize, hey, wait a second, this has 4 lights into it. There should be 4 shadows. What's going on? Okay, that rarely ever happens. You know, occasionally some people will. But if you're really concerned about it, this is what you can do. What you do is you take that one shadow that you have, and then you put it onto a card, and then you rotate it a certain amount of degrees in order to match all of the lights in the scene. And therefore, each of the lights of the scene can be projected seemingly from each of the shadows. Now, it doesn't really matter if you match the exact angle. No, it doesn't. This could be really sloppy. It's just because a lot of people see, okay, there's a lot of lights, there's a lot of shadows. I guess it must be correct. Okay, let's talk about the characters and the environment interactions. Now, characters behave as light emitters. We are talking about light spills onto the environment from the character. You know, let's see if they have glowing red eyes, or if they have a gun, or if they have a flashlight, or they have some kind of element on them like a television monitor or something that kind of emits some light. Now, make sure that when your character is emitting light that it's not emissive. Now, a lot of you folks up there love to go onto the material package, and they see that emissive category and they just crank away on that. Okay, that's fine. I get it. I like the emissive look too. But emissiveness is not light. It projects no light. And I've seen so many times people come to me and say, hey, Chris, my scene's all screwed up. I've got these lights all over the place, but they're not lighting anything. And I go, yeah, well, where are they? They show me, and then they show me the character, and the character is filled with emissive lights. And I say, well, you don't have any lights. It's all emissive. And they go, what's that? Yeah, exactly. So, okay, what you can do is create a lighting solar system. Like if your character is very stylistically rendered and it always has a halo or maybe a rim light around them, what you could do is create a lighting solar system. And that's kind of like you actually parent the lights, or you parent the lights to the character so that it's always creating a silhouette. It's always creating a rim light. It's always creating a shadow in a certain way. So it always complements each other. So this is a very effective way of actually working. Now, warn you, if you're working in a real-time engine, having a shadow casting light attached to a character and making that light dynamic could be kind of expensive. So watch out, you could be venturing into the danger zone again. Okay, three-point lighting is a super, super important lighting technique. It's very, very important. And it kind of like behaves like this. If you've never heard of three-point lighting, this will get you far. Okay, the first is the key light. And the key light, well, actually, there's three of them. There's fill light, key light, and rim light. Let's focus on these. If this is your scene as it looks already, let's put some key light in it. A key light is just one basic big directional light. Most of your shadows are going to come from this one main key light. And you see now that the shadows are kind of like coming in the directions, we've got some light coming off from this direction. It's shining right onto the environment, and there is just one big shadow coming off of it. Just one shadow. That's really all that you need. Okay, then you got to use fill light. And what fill light does is it fills in the light. It takes in and kind of like alleviates the areas out of blackness, out of shadow. This kind of takes it and kind of removes the kind of responsibility of the environment, and it takes it out of black and kind of fills in things. And so that's what the fill light is. It fills in your shadows. It kind of prevents them from going black. And then you finally have your rim light, and that acts as kind of like an accent in order to kind of create a little bit of contrast. See, I've got a little bit of rim light like around this angel's head and her wing on the side of there. And this is just to create a little bit of attention that kind of draws the audience into looking at the angel's face. Okay, so that's lighting. And so lighting is, like I said, a very, very important visual effect. But what about its corresponding? It's post-processing. Now, post-processing is all that is done once the images have been rendered to layers, and then after it's been rendered to layers, then visual effects are applied to it. In other words, visual effects magic is applied, or post-processing is applied, and that new layer has been adjusted, and then it is then composited or layered back on top of the scene and then put over that. Okay, so basically for every layer, includes the final layer if everything has already been blended together all at the same time. It affects all the pixels at the exact same time. So you have one basic visual effects function manipulating the entire visual image all at the same time. This is a reason why it's so powerful, because you get so much bang for just a little bit of buck. Anyway, when you're performing any kind of post-processing, make sure to do it after all of your lighting adjustments. If you're doing post-processing and you still have adjustments to make in your lighting, you're going to end up fighting the situation from two sides, and you'll never be able to get finished. So be aware of that. And also, make sure to turn off auto exposure. Auto exposure is deadly, not only for post-processing, but auto exposure is just evil for all lighting in general. Post-processing is a visual effect. It kind of like makes the scene look a little darker or a little brighter depending on where you were. And that kind of duplicates, like if you've been out in the sun all day and you come inside and then everything is going to be real dark and it takes a while for your eyes to adjust. Or if you wake up in the middle of the night and you go to the bathroom and you suddenly turn the light on and then suddenly you're blinded. That's because your lights have adjusted to the black and adjusted to the darkness, and then suddenly they have to deal with, okay, we've got this brightness and it's just too overwhelming. Anyway, that's auto exposure, and it's a visual effect. Wait until the very end to use auto exposure. Don't turn on auto exposure until the very end. Okay, the reason why you don't want auto exposure is because there's no constant base color, but that's a whole nother lecture. All right, here's the key factor for post-processing. When instead of actually rendering right to the frame buffer, you render to something is called a render target. And a render target is nothing but a full screen quad. What is a full screen quad? Well, that is what gets rendered. You have your render target, and it gets texture map onto this card. You know, it's a rectangle. That's really what it is. And it's just two triangles stacked right on top of each other. And the entire image of the screen that you're looking at gets mapped right on top of that. And then you perform a visual effect on that. What are these visual effects? Well, there's a bunch of types. There's three primarily. There's color filtering, and there's convolution and blur filters, and then there's other in-camera functions that kind of don't really fall into those categories. Okay, what is color filtering? Color filtering is a process where every pixel is rendered to the target and is multiplied by against a pre-generated filter matrix. Now, a matrix, you know, that's a 4x4 collection of numbers. Anyway, you multiply every single pixel against this pre-generated matrix, and it makes everything kind of change around. And it does this for every single pixel in the frame. And this is the reason why it's so important. This is where art directors come in, and then they really go to town. And it's within a matter of moments, the art director seems to put the scene into the right mood and tone because they just do a little bit of adjustments to the color filtering. Really, really powerful stuff. Now, there are a few specific types of color filtering. And the first you got to be aware of is filmic tone mapping. And the next you got to worry about is basic color grading. This is where you art directors really come in and shine. And then you have lookup tables, which is really kind of a way of creating an exterior file that will do the same process as your color grading. Okay, what's tone mapping? Tone mapping is, okay, even though you have film and you have video, they are robust things. They are robust. They try to capture as much environment as they can, but they can't capture everything. And so what they have is the tone mapping literally bends the color in order to fit within the display amount of your film or your video display, and it puts more colors in here. And see, we have the scene. This is before tone mapping, and this is after tone mapping, and you can see that this is a little bit richer. The colors are a little bit more vibrant, and we have a little bit more definition into the shadows and the depths, and that's because we're putting more color information than what the video device can actually handle. And this actually does. Now, is there some crunching of colors that goes into it? Yes, but the overall effect is you're going to end up with a better looking, more realistic image. And so that's what tone mapping is. Now, color mapping is kind of like, remember how I said we're going to go and manipulate every single pixel against one filter? Well, that one filter, in this case, it's going crazy ape nuts blue. You could do this with any color, and you could do this to the brights, you could do it to the darks, you could do it for the reds, the greens, and the blues. You could do this against for anything. And so any kind of color you see on the scene can be modulated and tweaked as long as it's done across the board for everything. And then we have color lookup tables. Now, a lookup table is exactly, this is an example of a lookup table. And you can see what they do is, believe it or not, inside of this color lookup table is every single color that can be manipulated. Every single color that can be manipulated is found on this. And then they take it into something like Photoshop, and then they do the color adjustments to make sure that this lookup table looks correct. And then they bring this lookup table back into Engine, and then they drop this into the scene and then multiply every scene, every pixel in the scene against this lookup table. And so they look up every single value of every pixel in here, find its equivalent amount, and then it takes its new value. And that is what a lookup table is. So you have all the power of tone mapping, all the power of color filtering, and you can embed them into one external texture map. Now, ultimately, this is not the best way of doing it, but I'm afraid we don't really have time to go into it. But just know that lookup tables are pretty groovy, and they can be a great way of having an instant environment lighting change by just dropping in a specific file. Pretty cool stuff. Okay, now let's talk about convolution filters. Now, convolution filters is a filter that's kind of like a color filter in that you're multiplying by a matrix, but what it's really doing is it's taking your current pixel value and then it's comparing all of its neighbors. And depending on the neighboring information, then it's going to take that information and then it's going to use that information in order to readjust the color of the current pixel that it's in. Now what we're looking at here is a 3x3 filter, and so the have a central pixel right here, and then the the 8 pixels that are surrounding it will be used to contribute to this specific color. And now this is really very popular technique for doing things like image blurring. Now, image blurring has a lot of opportunities. You could do image blurring, you could do bloom, you could use depth of field, and you could use lens flare. Okay, blurring, that's a separate topic that belongs into its own Tech Art Talk Live subject, but I'm just going to say that in the old days, this used to be super expensive. In the current real-time engines, this is kind of the norm. Stick with Gaussian Blur. Gaussian Blur creates the most natural fields on Earth, and it basically blurs every single point with its neighbors, basically on a distributed normal curve, you know, a bell curve. And so it follows that, and so it kind of like blurs all the thing depending on the colors of its environment. So Gaussian Blur, it's a little bit expensive, but really, according to real time, it kind of is the natural standard of things. And then you have bloom. What is bloom? Okay, what they do is they render the image right here. This is before the bloom. And then they render it to their render target. And then what they do is they isolate just the brightest parts. Then what they do is they blow it out, they make it, they increase it, make it brighter, and then they blur the dickens out of it. And then they take that new value of just the bright parts, and then they composite it, or they layer it back over itself again. And what that does is it makes the bright parts in the scene look like they're overwhelming the camera. And it has a way of pulling extra attention to the audience to these specific bright parts, which creates a very dramatic contrast. Okay, depth of field. This is also very, very important, especially in the cinematic world, where you want your audience to look at a certain thing. When you look at your eyes and you look at a camera, you'll tend to notice there's something called a depth of focus, or a focal distance, a focal length, if you would. Okay, that is where the object is in the most focus. Anything closer to the camera or to the eye, then that is going to be out of blur. Anything further than that focal length is going to be blurred. So therefore, depth of field really enforces the object in scene, and it puts the object that you want really inside the focus here. Now, depth of field is a little bit difficult to work for wide shots. It's very good for close-up scenes, but it is a great way of naturally forcing attention of the audience onto the specific object that you have within its proper depth of field. Okay, lens flare. Lens flare is a little bit like bloom, and what it does is it takes the brightest part of the scene and then it performs this crazy mathematical function, and what it does is it ends up with these 7 dots of it. And what do? They take those 7 dots, they blow them up, they make them really colorful, they blur them, and then they slap them back on top of it. You see, this is what we're doing. We're doing a lot of blurring, but we're taking parts of it, blurring it, and then putting it right on top of itself. Okay, now we don't really go into it, but emissive is another blur post-process technique. Yeah, okay. We thought we'd get into that. Okay, the last what I wanted to talk about are in-camera effects. Now these are just they don't really fall into the color filtering or the convolution filters. These are just kind of mathematical functions that are applied to all of the pixels into the scene at the same time. And there's things like vignetting, chromatic aberration, distortion, pixelization, dithering, and edge detection. And I'm going to go over what these are real quick. Vignetting is where you can see a central hotspot right in the edge. And if you look at old photography, like from the 1800s type old, you know, not from the 1980s. No, from the 1800s, you'll see that the object in the center is nice and bright, and then the image surrounding it is dark. That image around it, that darkening of the image around it, that's called vignetting. And it gives us, once again, this helps focus the attention right on the object into the center, is because it's going to be the brightest object in the scene. Chromatic aberration is a little bit of a kind of a psychedelic noise that people might put onto this, and it kind of like blurs and offsets the color and duplicates it off again, and kind of like makes it feel like, okay, you're nauseous or you're tripping on some pretty serious shrooms. Okay, distortion. Now this is where you take one texture and you use that texture to kind of like offset and jiggy wig your source image around. So here in this situation, I took this character here that's sitting right here, and then I grabbed this little kind of normal map, and then I use this normal map to kind of like make this object look a little kind of blurry and kind of move the pixels around and to kind of make it kind of distorted. Okay, this is really good when you want to go for kind of like an underwater scene, or if you're dealing with water and you want to make things look wet. This is a very effective technique for that. All right, pixelization. Pixelization is kind of like what you do when what they used to do when they wanted to censor things out. But really what they're doing is they're sampling groups of colors and then they're averaging them. And what that tends to do is it tends to blow things out and it makes things kind of look all pixelated. Okay, pixelation this is a pretty extreme example, but if you wanted to get something to look like a Game Boy or if you wanted to look kind of like pixelated, you know, pixelization is a good technique, and it's a simple and it's a cheap technique in order to achieve this process. Okay, dithering. Dithering is where they used to use in the old days, where they didn't have the full range of colors. You know, right now we have 256 values for every one of the channels. Okay, before that day, there was only maybe like 16 colors per channel. And so in order to do that, they use a process called half-toning or dithering in order to get it to look. And what that produces kind of like a striated, kind of like semi-pixelated look, but it actually made the audience, it's a visual effects trick. It made the audience see and think they were seeing more colors than were actually there. It's a pretty cool effect, and once again, right now, the only use of dithering is if you want to make something look kind of vintage, kind of look old, like circa something from the 80s or from the early 90s. Okay, edge detection is the last thing. Now, edge detection is the primary component of things like cell shading. Now, cell shading is a really popular look, or it's putting an outline around your objects in the scene. Now, believe it or not, this is not a real expensive process. This is really just a matrix that we're going to multiply against every pixel, and then depending on the contents of that, we're going to see if this object lights up. So the edge detection is a real simple post-process that can be done, and it can be combined with other things like cell shading or putting it right over the image to kind of give it the kind of the hand-drawn look in order to give those hard edges. All right, folks, I know that was not a lot of time, and I throw a whole lot of stuff at you, but that's what I wanted to cover as far as lighting and post-process effects are concerned. Now, doing this video, putting this thing together, I realized I forgot an important factor, and that is I didn't define what the real-time rendering pipeline was. So that's what we're going to do next week. Go join me on April 30th, next Friday, and we're going to talk about the 7 steps of the rendering pipeline. I know this might be fundamental for few of you graphics engineers or graphics programmers out there who really know your stuff, but for the rest of everybody, this is going to be kind of a refresher, and it's good to know what it is that you're dealing with and where you can and you can't manipulate your visual effects. Because honestly, folks, except for simulations, all visual effects is basically exploiting and manipulating the rendering pipeline. So you've got those 7 steps in there, and I'm going to explain where in those 7 steps you can actually go and manipulate and monkey around with things. All right, let's see. If you like what you saw today, go ahead and subscribe to this channel. Go ahead and check me out. I'm Chris Rhoda. You can check me out on Facebook or on LinkedIn, or you could go check out Art EDU, also on Facebook and on LinkedIn. And if you really want to help me, bop on over to the techartedu.com website and go ahead and sign up for our latest articles. Go ahead and opt in, and I keep on promising to send information and images to people and information, and I never get around to it. I know, I'm bad, but that just goes to show you, if you sign up for techartedu.com, the amount of emails and the spam you're going to get from me is virtually nothing. It's just, yeah, the marketing department at TechArt EDU is really lacking and I think needs to be replaced. All right. Thank you very much for joining me today, folks. I enjoyed going over this kind of like crash course, information intensive lecture dealing with lighting and post-processing. And I look forward to sharing the real-time rendering pipeline with you on next Friday. And until then, we'll see you later. Bye.